So as I'm sure as many of you may have seen, both increasing in frequency, virulence, and veracity, the prominence of left-leaning groups such as Antifa in public spaces engaging in what are almost unilaterally violent protests since the election of President Donald J. Trump, yes, my president and yours, are typified by a few general features. As such, today I want to describe the social identity of modern leftists, and the moral panic that they are engaged in as it only grows worse, with, for example, the rescinding of DACA. So prepare yourself, lads, because we're about to go balls deep into the psychology of far left-leaning groups, including Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and pretty much all of these crazy protesters you're seeing out on the streets of late. 1. A total inability to express the purpose of their protest, or the desired outcome beyond the, at most polite, the impeachment of Trump, or at worst, his outright assassination. I make note of this because seemingly every time I see a right-wing individual, or even just a free speech advocate, ask for what purpose they march, they are capable of giving a little bit more of a concise answer, even if it's just as concise as "I support Donald Trump," while asking the left will leave you with blank stares, screechy noises, or if you're particularly unlucky enough to end up talking to the militant wing of the left, Antifa, straight out physical violence and a punch to the face.
Yeah, all right, come on. Hey, we found this man will talk to us, so why should Trump be impeached?
Because he's lied 1,000 times on record.
What does he lie about?
Should we look it up on his phone?
No, he's recording right now. But you're the one saying impeach the president. Yeah, because you're the one who wants to impeach him.
I mean, I can't impeach him myself.
But you're out here with the impeach Trump crowd.
Yeah, I would love to advance an impeachment agenda.
Well, good to see you again. What are we doing here today?
We are protesting against Trump again.
What for this time?
That's something you would have to ask. Refuse fascism.
Not sure?
Not sure.
Most of these people, they can't name a specific strife they have with the president.
We don't want to fucking hear from you. Get the fuck away from us. We don't want to fucking hear from you. We got nothing to fucking say to you. Get the fuck away from our
Get out of his face.
We don't want anything to do with you. You're a fucking fash. We don't fucking need you here. Best you guys.
This incoherence is important to note as we go forward. 2. That despite this incoherence, there is a massive amount of organization across the supposedly disorganized groups. Antifa members will outright tell you that their groups have no organization, despite the fact that they have websites that they all congregate on. But let's leave that aside for a moment. The Women's March, which chose to feature hack broads, thanks, stealing that from you, Mitch, like Linda Sarsour on stage along with convicted murderers, as apparently they're symbols of exemplary women to look towards, took at least a month to organize, and saw tens of thousands of women in their knitted pussy hats on the National Mall speaking out against...
I don't want your camera in my face.
All right, well, don't you have a message, though?
Your camera at my face.
Well, why are you protesting then?
Why are you protesting?
Actually, I do have permission. Yeah, I don't need permission. You're on public property. You're on public property. But how come you're protesting, but when there's media here to cover your protest, you don't want your message out? Why is that?
Well, again, see point 1. What is more terrifying is that it took less than a week to see the same relative number of people turn out for these same dazed and confused individuals to show up in protest of a free speech rally against individuals with Black Lives Do Matter signs at Boston. This is important because it illustrates that these groups are not only clueless, but they are motivated, and motivated enough to come out en masse over and over again to burn American flags, to decry free speech, which in the next very sentence they will claim to be fighting for, along with American values. Clearly, this is a deep-seated motivation to continually draw crowds of the thousands to attack others without cognizant rationale. What I mean by that is they're certainly motivated to come out, but they can't explain why, and that seems to be a little bit of a conundrum. 3. That until very recently, and I would warn that what we are now seeing is likely merely defensive behavior, is that the mainstream media, which is predominantly leftist, has done very little to denounce or decry any violent action carried out by Antifa. In fact, they barely even mention it it if they mention it at all. To any observer not entirely within this social identity envelopment, which will be described and explicated in detail, the obvious hypocrisy of the media may be just that, obvious. Why were Trump's words about violence on both sides such anathema when there has been violence on both sides? When, in reality, the majority of property damage has in fact been committed by the left? Why was Trump called a Nazi for this, and the violent actions of Antifa not also called out by the media? Why was only Trump at fault?
He's unhinged. It's embarrassing, and I don't mean for us, the media, because he went after us, but for the country. This is who we elected president of the United States, a man who is so petty that he has to go after people who he deems to be his enemy, like an imaginary friend of a 6-year-old. His speech was without thought, it was without reason, it was devoid of facts, it was devoid of wisdom, there was no gravitas, there was no sanity there. He was like a child blaming a sibling on something else.
Well, simply, and before we go deeper into this topic, here is why. Because the mainstream left is ideologically indistinguishable from their militant arm, Antifa, and further Black Lives Matter. This is why the term alt-right is ultimately meaningless, but nonetheless, have you noticed, makes the left and left-leaning media figures and individuals absolutely irate. The term alt-right, in contrast, has become a signal that someone is a racist, sexist bigot, as shorthand that someone is a Nazi, and therefore it's okay to bash them because they're alt-right. Therefore they are a Nazi. These two things are associated with one another. Of course, the same people who throw away that term as an easy justification apply it liberally to everyone they don't agree with politically. Don Lemon thinks that Paul Joseph Watson is probably as much of the alt-right as is Richard Spencer, and anyone who thinks like Don Lemon, though they think that as well. That is pretty much all of the mainstream left, and far leftist groups. So sometimes when I say leftist, I'm generally referring to far left groups, but it also does apply to the mainstream left. The only people using terms like alt-right are those generally within the actual alt-right who are capable or willing to identify the difference, or people like myself who give a shit. Many leftists therefore think that following the standard of people like Don Lemon, think that everyone from Ann Coulter to Tucker Carlson is equally part of the alt-right, and that the alt-right is a cohesive neo-Nazi organization, and as such, it is okay to bash all of them, to engage in physical violence if need be. They have no desire nor ability to discern someone as an establishment right-winger from anyone who may actually fall under the broad and nebulous umbrella that defines alternative right-wing politics. Because of this, while the term alt-left is totally meaningless, and by the way, I prefer control-left, that's much wittier and more apt, honestly, it also serves to make these people who have come to use the term alt-right in the way I have described absolutely batshit irate, because it turns the implication of fascism back around on them. And funnily enough, given the conflation of all right-wing politics, no matter how mainstream or benign, with Nazism and fascism and authoritarianism, turning the phrase around applies the same affiliation with the most violent and destructive aspects of the left with their mainstream ideological social ubiquity. That is why it makes them so angry. It is turning the mirror to every moderate leftist and showing them that they are pretty much the same as the people burning cars, because here's the thing, they agree with the politics of those people. Except unlike with all attempt to paint all of the right as alt-right, the alt-left really does describe pretty much all of them. Mainstream leftists agree with Antifa on politics, just not on practice. That's pretty much it. I support the use of the term only because I know it pisses them off, and it implies the same condemnation of them all as okay to bash. That is precisely why only recently have we seen any condemnation of the violent actions of Antifa, because the mainstream left once again agrees with Antifa and experiences a level of cognitive dissonance, a feeling of psychological discomfort when confronted with ideas or information that contradicts their held beliefs. That is, when given evidence that Antifa uses fascist tactics nearly indecipherable from the brown shirts they supposedly hate so much and the communist revolutionaries against which the brown shirts were a response, that creates cognitive dissonance, and at least for now, the mainstream is distancing themselves from their shared ideological group. We could surmise, seemingly, that a certain amount of the protesters who show up with cleanly, professionally printed signs on a day's notice, who are incapable of explaining their reasoning for protesting, who are not being condemned for their vile behavior, are in fact paid by political interest groups, or by certain individuals seeking to control public discourse. Craigslist ads for months have offered a hefty coin purse for individuals to come out and counter-protest. In fact, we've also maybe seen people coming out of the same buses. Being busted in general is somewhat illuminating, is it not? I even found Craigslist ads in my little town before the election, and we have seen them and will continue to see them, I'm sure. But although paid protesters would be an excellent explanation for these three qualities I have described, the sheer numbers of irate, clueless, and morally outraged protesters, both online and off, is just far too large to adequately describe this phenomena. As such, we need to examine the psychology of what is happening here. I often have provided reasons for the backlash against Trump, but in this video I wish to tackle specifically the causes behind these protests and the absolute moral outrage experienced therein. There are further reasons beyond cognitive dissonance in being confronted with the reality that one's ideas and values do not match the behavior they implicitly support because it is ideologically compliant with right think. No, calling leftists the alt-left is also what I would describe as a face threat, a threat to one's identity. And that leads us to the major topic at hand today: social identity, stigma, and finally, moral panic. First, I want to begin by describing a study many of you may be aware of, the infamous Stanford prison experiment. I think I've described it before. The study was conducted by Dr. Philip Zimbardo in 1971, wherein participants were given a couple buckaroos to play the role of either a guard or a prisoner to analyze the effects of given social roles on behavior, with Dr. Zimbardo himself serving as the simulated prison's warden. What some of you may not know is that the individuals randomly selected to be the prisoners in the study were actually taken from their homes under the pretense that they were being arrested, and despite having previously signed a waiver to participate, may have been actually confused as to the reality and seriousness of the situation, perhaps adding an element of external validity to the study that it may have otherwise lacked. Long story short, what happened is, within a week, the experiment needed to be shut down because the prisoners and guards had become so aggressive and involved in their given roles that violence began breaking out. Dr. Zimbardo himself said he had become so enveloped by his role as warden that he needed to be encouraged to end the experiment.
I see in the future that you do work when you're told. Say it again. Say bless you, correctional.
I was sort of fascinated myself that people were believing the act, and I was trying to see how far I could take it before somebody would say, okay, that's enough, stop.
We did have to do things like push-ups, we would have to sing things. At the beginning, we protested some of the actions, we did things to irritate the guards.
So the guards' authority was challenged right off the bat. And the guards had to decide how they were going to handle that, and they had to decide it without our input. I mean, again, this was not a Milgram study in which we were standing over them telling them what to do. And they began to see the prisoners' behavior as a kind of an affront to their authority, and they began to push back.
We would ramp up the general harassment, just sort of crank it up a bit. Nobody was telling me I shouldn't be doing this. The professor is the authority here. You know, he's the prison warden.
While the Stanford prison experiment was a revolutionary study, both for reasons of the later reinforcement of IRB, that is institutional review boards, one of which did actually fucking give a go-ahead on this study, which is very interesting, meaning that a board of people looked at this proposal and said, yeah, it's okay. That's kind of how astounding the results were. But more importantly, to understand how relative anonymity, and what I will often refer to here on out as de-individuation, that is the loss of self-awareness and psychological disinhibition in anonymous situations, and given roles, can completely create a chaotic environment wherein social identity overrides the personal identity. This is what Spears and colleagues, 1994-2007, decades later would describe as social identity model of de-individuation effects, or the SIDE model, in associating social identity, particularly in computer-mediated context, with de-individuation. The Stanford prison experiment was not the first famous study attributable to Dr. Zimbardo, analyzing how anonymity affects behavior. Zimbardo in '69 found that when participants' faces and bodies were obscured, they were treated with less care by other participants. Participants were more likely to engage in violent behavior by shocking a fellow participant when their face was obscured by a hood. When both parties were anonymous, individuals tended to disregard social norms. Anonymous individuals do not need fear repercussions of their actions and are able to act in a disinhibited fashion without concern for the possible consequences of those actions. Sounded like anybody we know, a little reminiscent of Antifa with the covered faces? Well, you're anonymous. Your actions don't really have any consequence because your personal identity is obfuscated. This too, though, was not the first major piece of research that indicated the effects of group identity and conformity. Almost 2 decades earlier, Asch, 1951, identified that willingness to conform to a group of participants was so strong that individuals would essentially lie about the length of a line if 2 or more individuals also involved in the study agreed on a false length of the line.
A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
Please begin. The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length, Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example, if you...
The actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1.
1. It's 2.
1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3.
3. 3.
3.
That there are 5 lights, when in reality, we know there are only 4.
There are 4 lights!
As the extent of anonymity grows, so does the lack of self-awareness and subsequent de-individuation of facts. When persons do not feel as if they are seen as individuals, they become subject to de-individuation, leading to uninhibited behavior. Again, think back to Antifa this entire time, it should be obvious what I'm describing. Growing amounts of anonymity lead to decreased self-awareness, self-evaluation, and an inability to accept responsibility for one's actions. Spears and Leah, 1994, stated that anonymity allows one to express one's true mind, or authentic self, unfettered by the confines of self-presentation. This is sort of where anonymity has positive and negative effects. It does allow you to express what you really feel, but it also can have some very negative outcomes. When provided with an anonymous situation, the constrictions of social norms and self-presentation no longer apply. This does mean that you can be as violent or as open as you want to be. It allows for de-individuated persons to engage in anti-normative behavior. Fessinger, Pepitone, and Newcomb, 1952, found that in anonymous settings with increased de-individuation, people are less likely to act in accordance to social norms and more likely to act in a totally uninhibited manner without concern for others both within and without the anonymous situation. Disinhibition can be negative or positive, as I mentioned, depending on various other factors facing the de-individuated persons. In the presence of groups, moreover, the presence of social groups and other de-individuated persons may alter the types of behavior a person engages in while anonymous. One last time, where have we seen individuals obfuscate their faces and identities to engage in violent behavior for? Oh, yep, all across self-described members of the amalgamation of unorganized but totally organized groups that share a social identity, Antifa, and extreme leftists. Diner 1977 defined the nature of de-individuation as a 3-component process through which it occurs. First, there must be a situational cause of the anonymity. Traditionally, this would be a dark area or a crowded street or a riot, which would provide situations for de-individuation effects to occur. Any scenario wherein people's faces or bodies are obfuscated can also cause an activation of de-individuation effects. Again, a bit common in the black-clad Antifa we've seen. Online environments also provide a high level of de-individuation due to the lack of nonverbal cues and social presence. Might be why people were so fucking rude online. In fact, there's a lot of research on that. But once within an anonymous environment, the effects of de-individuation become apparent. As de-individuation is a loss of the sense of the self as an individual, any identity cues that are present then take precedence in the interaction. That is that when I am de-individuated, I literally lack individuation. That's what it means. So instead, without a sense of the self, I need to have some form of self-identity. What happens instead? The group identity becomes more salient. And herein comes social identity theory, my jam. Social identity theory defines the self by internalized membership in multiple groups. That's Tajfel and Turner, 1986, Turner and Oakes, 1986. Social identity is part of an individual's self-concept which derives from his knowledge of his group membership of a social group or groups, together with the emotional significance attached to that membership. That's Tajfel, 1974, page 69. In the context of social identity, the sense of self is derived as a product of membership in various social groups. That is, that the social identity is set both as to who am I associated with, and who is not associated with us. The social self is constructed as an emergent group process, meaning it occurs over time, wherein group identity is an internalized part of an individual's entire perception of the self. That is, that every single one of us has multiple group identities. Group identities can be malleable or they can be fixed. For example, one group identity that we all have is our gender. You will always be perceived either as a woman or a man, generally speaking, unless the SJWs totally take over. And, you know, excluding extreme anomalies like Pat.
Help me, someone please help me.
And I need some feminine napkins.
Oh, I'm in hell. I am in hell now.
and part of how others perceive you and how you perceive yourself is in some way inalienably tied to your sex. Other social identities are much less fixed. For example, if you're a fan of a TV show and you go to a convention, you are hanging out with people who are also fans of that TV show, and therefore you all share a social identity as fans of said TV show. Though we have our own personal identities, that personal identity is still linked to all of the massive web of social identities we're also involved in. You can't really pull them apart because we are a social species, so everything that makes up your sense of self is going to at least be a part, if a part at the center of the web of what makes me, me, and what makes you, you. Social identity versus personal identity. The description first coined by Erik Erikson. But going back to de-individuated environments, when the personal identity is obfuscated or hidden, what once again becomes more salient is one's group identities, and whatever group identity is activated is based on the people that we're around. How do we recognize group identities when we're in an anonymous environment? Well, symbols are one way, and if you're all clad in the exact same type of clothing, you recognize that these people are part of your shared social group. Yeah, if everyone who shares your group is also wearing a mask, again eliminating the sense of personal self to the de-individuated state, that alone is a symbol of group membership. Of course, as emotions and rage become more volatile, we have seen symbols of group identity alone will not save us from the outbursts of their violent brethren, who in their anger keep mistaking their own comrades for their enemies. Yeah, it means that even if you show up at these Black Bloc protests dressed in their uniform, they still might just want to beat you up. Yet through all of their violence and outrage, even to the point of their social identity-oriented de-individuation making them lash out against their own, we see that the mainstream and their militant arm, Antifa, view what they are doing as moral and justified.
What do you think of Antifa?
Antifa? They're pretty admirable sometimes. Yeah, because they engage in direct action.
They do also partake in some violence too.
Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes violence is necessary.
I believe that there is a tremendous danger here in making false equivalencies between, I think we're in danger of doing the same thing that, frankly, the president got in trouble on Tuesday for doing, which is by saying that there's violence on many sides,
CNN, although they did later change the headline, pretty much outright supported the violence of Antifa as necessary to assure peace. While we will go further into what is happening there with the concept of moral panic, let's first examine the individual psychology of the average leftist engaged in this behavior through some of the frameworks of Jung, particularly that in part of our psyche, we all have subjective components that like to paint ourselves as easygoing, agreeable, and good-willed. We all like to believe that we are good people, pretty much. Much like fundamental attribution error, we tend to think of ourselves as good, as a sort of personal mythos, and others, particularly when they fail, as bad. However, this is exactly how that works, a myth. Of course, for our ego preservation, we view ourselves as the hero of our own story. But in addition to what we know about anonymity, creating a proclivity to engage in antisocial behavior, particularly when our social identities are activated in a de-individuated environment, even individual psychological analysis can help explain the contagion of emotion across groups. As Jung describes, helping to explain why even merely pseudonymous individuals, meaning you're not entirely anonymous, not clad in black masks, are so irate and confrontational. They are experiencing what he describes as pathological emotions, which eclipse their own consciousness. This is not a form of psychosis according to Jung, but rather a normal part of the psychological process, wherein the individual enters a dreamlike state of emotional contagion and comes out the other side unscathed, being totally immersed in emotion rather than logic. Jung calls this an invasion of the psyche, and when you see how even the individuated persons are engaging in this behavior and are beyond even basic communication, is there truly a better description of what is happening to these people than a total invasion or eclipse of emotion? Oh, don't bring up the eclipse. We all know that's racist. But let's get further away from the individual psyche and into the collective psyche, since, hey, that's what I know better. Well, not in the way Jung described it, but rather into the theory of social identity. We have a definition for social identity, we understand some of how this individual psychology of these people involved may be working, and we understand that social identities under de-individuation, the side model, and other facets of anonymity are more salient than personal identities when we are de-individuated. Let's examine some of the other aspects of social identity research that may seek to explicate why, for example, right-wingers, who are certainly as de-individuated, relatively, as one side sure has a hard-on for dog doxing and getting people fired over the other, and therefore just as likely to fall into these same anonymous behaviors and pitfalls of our left-wing counterparts. Yet, as far as I've seen, the right-wing are seemingly far more capable of individuating themselves even in these protests, explaining their standpoint and engaging in dialogue.
I went over to the left side to see if I could engage them with dialogue, and I was instantly encircled by the so-called anti-fascists.
The man who allegedly sucker punched him quickly identified himself on Twitter after the rally, tweeting that he did it because Maxwell wouldn't stop talking about Trump and that he isn't racist. When someone called for his arrest, he replied, quote, "Please arrest me, LMFAO."
Now there is a whole fucking lot to break down here, so let's get into it. First, we could begin with data from Miller et al. 2009, in which understanding of social identity complexities was associated with higher need for cognition, that is, a desire to gather more information on a topic, and close-mindedness, which in this context means a desire to come to a conclusion about a topic. In other words, people with more need for cognition and more close-mindedness, they were able to differentiate various social identities both within themselves and within others, to understand that an individual is not the sum of one social identity, but rather a very complex web of multiple social identities. Further research from Chirimbolo 2002 and Kamelmeyer 1997 have connected right-wing political ideologies with a need for closure, which is fairly similar to a need for cognition and for closed-mindedness. That is, while I cannot locate a single study that assesses all of these variables in tandem, what we may be able to derive, at least as a guess, is that right-wing individuals and conservatives, being more closed-minded or more accurately having a higher need for closure, may also have more complex social identities that they can recognize, also recognizing those complex social identities in others, being able to understand that political ideology and political identity is not the only identity that composes the sense of self. Hey, I'd love to test this, by the way, but this is just a guess as to when we may be seeing a difference in understanding that others are not only the contents of their social affiliation, and I mean, well, we sure kind of are seeing that, aren't we?
Is there anybody over here that is capable of an intelligent conversation who can explain why any of these people are Nazis? Anybody at all? Anybody capable of saying more than 2 words? Anybody who is capable of saying more than 2 words?
The entire left calls the entire right literal double Hitler Nazis. I don't see that happening on the right. I don't see anyone on the right, maybe some, saying absolutely everyone on the left is Stalin. I just don't see that. You know, this particular explanation of this need for cognition, need for closure, and the recognition of complex social identities, that just might help explain some things. But again, it's just a guess, and it's one that needs more explanation and investigation. I just like to explore all kinds of avenues of research. Let's then look at some other venues of explication for why this may be happening, and at least for now, why there's seemingly a difference between left and right in these confrontations. Remember when I mentioned how the term alt-left is so triggering to the left because it forces them to recognize that the mainstream has more in common with Antifa politically than they like to think? That, as I mentioned earlier, is a sort of identity threat. The very claim that Antifa is a terrorist organization, while you agree with them and you perceive them sort of as a part of your social identity as a leftist, that is a threat to the entire social identity as your sense of self, as you are part of the left, as you are one of those on the right side of history. The left pretty much will not attack Antifa, or at least has been avoiding doing so, because it is an attack on their own social identity. It's attacking your friend. Therefore, when someone insults or confronts the problems of violence inherent across Antifa and Black Lives Matter behaviors, given that they are obvious and upfront in their use of violent rhetoric and behavior, that person is ostensibly offending and attacking the mainstream left's entire social identity, providing an identity threat and therefore a threat to the sense of self. Who am I?
A group that is a protest group, 2 protest groups, yes, they're both protest groups, and they're talking about Antifa or Antifa, however you want to pronounce it, calling them the alt-left. Well, that group protests fascism, so they were there protesting fascism. Maybe their tactics weren't exactly right. All groups like that, political groups, rights groups, protest groups, it's messy.
You are attacking me because you are attacking someone who is associated with my in-group. Typically, and particularly in large groups, we do not seek to be identical to every other individual within any groups that we share a social affiliation. One of the things about cults is that they tend to be smaller and all individuals are needed to conform. But large groups, it's a little bit different. Although our social identities do comprise an inexorable part of our personal identity, our personal identity also exists outside of our group identifications. We are more than the sum of the groups to which we belong. As such, typically we will seek to achieve what Brewer 1991 describes as optimal group distinctiveness. Just enough of me, just enough of us or them.
I see. Well, who am us anyway?
We're one of you. And you're one of us, I think.
However, optimal group distinctiveness does not occur in all instances. Specifically, Badea, Jeton, Jokar, and Askevis-Leherpeux, 2010, identified that face threat tends to overwhelm desires of assertion for optimal group distinctiveness. That is, while we inherently want to assert our own personal identity, particularly in large groups, when our identity is being threatened, optimal distinctiveness falls into the background. The personal identity, much as with de-individuation, falls away. As such, is it any surprise that the left is behaving in the manner in which they are behaving? Their identity was fatally threatened when Donald Trump won the US presidency against, in their minds, a complete impossibility perpetuated by the media, against all odds. This activated a threat to shared social identity, as they were sure to win, yes? Moreover, this face threat is potentially responsible for the ongoing outrage, violence, and riots. The left views their entire sense of the self, such as it is tied to leftist politics, being attacked through the continued presidency of Trump and through the resurgence of right-wing politics to the forefront, given that we all kind of had to take a backseat during Obama, and given the desperate attempts to homogenize their own political beliefs as the only acceptable ones over that 8-year span. When you attempt to talk to one of these people, you are not activating their personal identity of who are you as an actual person, but rather you're activating their group identity. You are the outsider, and you are threatening their identity by asking questions that could contradict their accepted narrative, that could create cognitive dissonance, that affects and attacks their group. What happens in response? Personal identity and the desire for optimal distinction is abandoned in favor of the social identity. Speaking of talking, that is why we find very few leftists on the street, or even online, willing to do so. Yes, talk, and talk is very important, and I think their leaders know that, and that is a reason why their leaders don't want them to engage in communication. The mere exposure effect and the contact hypothesis. The mere exposure effect, that's Zhejiang 1968, is the term for the propensity for us to come to like those we engage with the longer we engage with them. It's not a determinant. I mean, you may start work with somebody and you hate them instantly. It doesn't matter if you work with them for 10 years, you may still hate them. However, we do see that the more time we spend with people, the more we tend to like them. In fact, that's how a lot of relationships start. Just spending time with someone makes you come to like them. Moreover, there's the contact hypothesis, which is Allport 1954, which illustrates similarly that the more we interact with a group we previously held a negative association toward, the more we come to individualize persons of that group and reduce prejudice. Specifically, in the application of social identity, this is described as the intergroup contact theory, that's Pettigrew 1998, and echoing the seminal research of Allport illustrates consistently that communication with an outgroup decreases intergroup animosity. What a surprise! The more time you spend with people and get to know them, the less you hate their group. Is it any surprise then that the mainstream media is also so adamant about demonizing any on the right, and that leftist thought leaders discourage communication? For if you talk to your political opponent, you might just end up not viewing them as literal fucking Hitler, right? And we cannot have that. Oh no, absolutely not. Don't talk, just shout or blow your little whistle. If you allow them to talk to you, then the villainy of their wrongthink might accidentally enter in your brain and spread like a cancer. Yes, cancer of actual fucking thought. If you have noticed any similarities between what I have been describing in terms of social identity and a religion or a cult, you would not be incorrect. In fact, much research on social identification has been concerned with religions and cults. I would not deign to refer to the left as a whole as a cult. That would be an absurd oversimplification. But we do see many cult tactics associated with social identity being utilized by the left, particularly the far left. If you wanted to learn more about what it means to be part of a cult from a far more emotional and realistic standpoint than I could ever provide, I suggest, if you, for some reason, haven't already, checking out my man Hard Bastard, as he lived through this shit and escaped from it, having been part of the Jehovah's Witness cult, and I almost feel like I'm trapezing on his area of personal expertise as I go into this, but I like the sciencey side of things. So let's go into understanding a little bit more about group identity, part of which, as Caporio 1997 describes as shared origin stories. Almost all groups are going to have these, and in my attempt to be as objective as possible, I need to state that. But one thing I find very prominent across modern leftists is the mythologization of their origin story, that things that brought them to this point, and also magical thinking. In terms of the origin story, it's clearly the election of Trump. We all came here, we heroes, we all got to this point because we have to fight the dragon, that is Trump, and there's so much research on psychology in terms of the role of the hero and the dragon which they must slay. So much like a religion, we see a shared origin story. So let's move on to magical thinking. Many Many social groups engage in magical thinking and associated behaviors, from cults and religious organizations to fans of television or media just really wanting their TV show to come back. It is typified by believing in symbols, symbolic actions such as prayer, and allows for complexities of the universe to be transformed into abstract symbols or metaphors further. There's nothing inherently wrong with magical thinking. It's a basic process of psychology, in which, in many ways, makes coping with difficult situations or ideas more palatable, and gives an individual a sense of a feeling of power or influence over his or her life. What do we see at many of these protests? Again, little ability to describe the problem beyond the metaphor, and certainly no real action being done. They can't describe any of this beyond the abstract. Trump's the problem. And what is Trump? Well, I frequently see him being defined in other easily to digest metaphors for a concept of evil. He is Hitler, he is Voldemort, he is the Emperor. They believe they can stop these symbolic Nazis through the same type of symbolic behavior by merely praying for it intensely enough. They don't have a real outcome. They're just out there to pray. I have previously likened some of this behavior to the stages of grief, something even at the time I said was a poor argument because the stages of grief are honestly pseudoscience at best, but magical thinking is a well-documented psychological phenomena that fits in well with an analysis of the left from the standpoint of social identity. Moreover, magical thinking is common in instances of emotional coping, and as we will learn later, may help cope with the moral panic being exercised in because of the perceived metaphorical evil that they believe must be exorcised. Along with shared origins, be they religious or historic, groups display something called group affinity. We have been over this, but in more precise detail, we find that in-group love does not necessarily require out-group hate. Specifically, Brewer 1999 states, quote, "In-group bias and intergroup discrimination is motivated by preferential treatment of in-group members, rather than a direct hostility toward out-group members." This finding and subsequent findings that support it are important because they illustrate that just because we don't share a social identity with another person doesn't mean we automatically hate that person, merely that we have an affinity for those who share our shared social in-group. This is seemingly positive news, right? It indicates that disagreement does not make us all somehow a separate species incapable of communication, not that they would allow us to engage in communication. But here's the bad news. Parker and John F. Bullman 2013 found that in groups based on a shared morality forming their group, there is a higher propensity for the dichotomization of emotions of in-group love and out-group hate. The left's entire hatred of Trump and his supporters and all right-wingers is emotional and morality-based, at least their perception of morality. As I explicated, using group symbolic metaphor and magical thinking portrayed Trump as Hitler and all Trump supporters or anyone on the right as a literal Nazi brown shirt. No matter how ironic the comparison, as Antifa marches through the streets engaging in the exact same tactics as Ernst Röhm. As such, despite the fact that Pettigrew gives us hope in intergroup contact theory and further that there is nothing inherent about group affiliation that causes one to hate their outgroups, how often do you see many of these oft-violent protesters willing to engage intellectually or at all with anyone not expressing the minimal group symbolic identification in the form of shared clothing and signs? Very rarely, and when they do, typically with hostility. For fuck's sake, we've seen they engage with their own shared in-group with hostility when they get a little bit too confused and riled up. That is because the face threat has been activated. The very election of Trump places these individuals in a constant state of needing to save group identity face, and as such, aspects of personal identity which would typically differentiate the self from the group collective have become atypical, which in turn means in-group and out-group salience take precedence over other concerns. As such, communication is rarely brokered. In this way, as with many others, we do see similarities between cult behavior and the modern leftist movements. A constantly activated social identity in response to face threats suffocating the expression of the personal identity and moreover a sense of import of the group placed before the self as an identity. As Caporal 1997 also describes in his examination of religious cults and groups, a shared origin story, a shared social affinity that is love for their fellows, magical thinking and abstraction of nuanced topics into the symbolic performance of behaviors intended to have a metaphysical or psychic effect on reality, an unwillingness to speak with outside parties even though there is nothing inherent about group affiliation that causes out-group hate, even with the propensity for out-group hate in moral groups. Why is it that communication is such heresy? Well, in staying in line with the similarities to cults and religious organizations, I think I may have another idea. I believe it goes beyond merely unfortunate propensity against intergroup communication, further preventing dialogue, and engaging in behavior that may potentially activate intergroup contact theories, potentials for distaste in an outgroup to be lessened. What do we see being peddled in the mainstream media? Why, a very activation of the symbolic elements of in-group versus out-group using metaphors.
Stopping looking the other way and confronting the fact that he's not only unfit to be president. In my book, his lack of empathy, his lack of leadership, his lack of courage, he's unfit to be human.
Really? Well, I don't, if you vote for a racist, what are you then? Because it sure sounds like racism to me.
One is a Nazi white supremacist group. What they want to do, and in their hearts, is extinguish people who look like me and who look like you, Wolf. Jewish people, black people, even women. They don't think that we're equal to them.
Again, to associate the out group as an utterly detestable, outright bunch of subhumans who should not be spoken to. We have seen this time and time again, but since the tragic events at Charlottesville, the propensity to call everyone right of Marx himself a Nazi has become the dominant political and social narrative of the media. And we are seeing it again now with DACA. If you are with Trump, then you are a racist. You are a Nazi. A common tactic across pretty much all cults is the isolation of the individual from friends, family, and loved ones into the new family, discouraging, if not outright forbidding, contact with those associated with your previous life. Given the new guilt by association that is being lobbed recklessly by the mainstream media, that anyone who voted for Trump, anyone who supports him, anyone who is right-wing is a Nazi KKK racist, of course, you, as a moral leftist person, morally outraged by Trump, already with a propensity for out-group hate, are going to want to distance yourself as far as possible from Trump and his supporters and all right-leaning individuals, because after all, you don't want to be associated with this symbol of evil that you are trying to pray away so much. As such, this is why communication is not occurring and why it is very likely not going to occur. It doesn't help, by the way, when even online and across people who view themselves as rational refuse to engage in conversation with the so-called alt-right and discourage others from doing so as well, to avoid conversation or discourse with them, because after all, were you to talk to someone who identifies as alt-right, despite, disagreeing with them politically, such as myself, oh whoops, that intergroup contact hypothesis effect may just pop up and you might start to realize that they're not such pieces of vile scum that you have been otherwise led to believe. And also that labeling someone as a witch, I mean alt-right, just because you don't agree with them, is outright dishonest. Just a little aside and a little preview of the witch stuff which we'll be getting to in the second half of this video series. But before I end on this part, I must explain Goffman on Stigma. Really quickly, well, as quickly as possible, it's me. You guys know me. I have spoken extensively about the left's behavior and group identification up until this point to try and provide a scientific lens through which to view and understand what the fresh fuck is happening, why are they behaving this way, and why they are so seemingly clueless at the reality and the consequences of their own behavior. But, given I have spoken about the alt-right just now, I want to spend a few moments addressing the other side and the effects and consequences of stigma. Goffman, 1963, described stigma as a deeply discrediting attribute, one which renders the stigmatized person as not quite human to the observer, the normal. While Goffman was in many ways focused, as was a hotter topic at the time, on physical deformations and the very symbols of in-group out-group affiliation, in this case stigmatized versus non-stigmatized, these same symbols can be utilized to define or identify a stigmatized person who is stigmatized for non-physical reasons. For example, a former criminal, a prostitute, or now, at least according to the majority of leftists and pretty much all of the mainstream media, anyone who voted for Trump or anyone with even slightly right-leaning politics. Moreover, there can be a carryover effect, what Goffman calls a courtesy stigma. If your father is an ex-convict, then something about his stigma has a scaffolding effect onto you. If your father is a Trump supporter, then in some way you are complicit in his non-human status. As such, once again, we see a rationale for the abandonment of any who bear these right-wing identity pegs. Just as the left's own social identity has its symbols of virtue and morality, of being part of this moral-based group, or so as they perceive themselves, so do they have methods of pegging the stigmatized. Are you wearing a Trump hat? Are you not dressed in black? But a few things to note about the stigmatized is that they do tend to group together, and they tend to do this in private. But this group also comes with a lot of purity testing of its own. For example, a stigmatized person, a Trump supporter, may feel more disgust at the death of Heather Heyer because he sees it as someone in his group behaving poorly, despite the fact that as of this writing, the circumstances of her death are still kind of unclear, whether it was panic or outrage or what.
We disavow this. We have nothing to do with it. We disavow the alt-right. Proud Boys are not alt-right. I've said it a million times and I'll say it a million more. Not to virtue signal, not to gain friends, but because it's the truth.
And given the already negative association with the stigmatized, this can cause a lot of infighting. Another area of contention is failure to provide proof of authenticity. We see this in the deaf community, for example, that children who get cochlear implants are somehow impure or inauthentic, and while purity tests are common in many groups, this is another area to be wary, because all of this leads to disassociation and, again, infighting. And oh boy, what am I seeing a lot of lately? A lot of infighting on the right. Another pitfall, as described by Goffman, is a tendency to truncate our social identity identities away from the multifold and multivariate set of more or less salient identities that we hold at any one point in time, in preference for the constantly stigmatized identity. That is, the identity that we view ourselves as is the one that is stigmatized first and foremost regardless of the situation. This again is not really a smart thing to do, just as we're seeing with the left with their constantly activated social identity. Finally, despite how easy it is to want to lash out against these rioting lefties who obviously are so confused for all the reasons I have explicated up to this point, and for even more reasons as I will describe in the next part of this video, who actually think Trump is a fucking Russian Nazi because that makes sense, it is not the best course of action to lash out against them. Reading from Goffman one last time, page 116, here is his suggestion of how to deal with lefties, which in this context will be appropriately called the normals. Quote, normals really mean no harm. When they do, it's because they don't know better. And I don't necessarily agree with that statement in our current environment. I think some of them really don't know better, but some of them do mean harm. Continuing. They should therefore be tactfully helped to act nicely. Slights, snubs, and untactful remarks should not be answered in kind. Either no notice should be taken or the stigmatized individual should make an effort at sympathetic re-education of the normal, showing him point for point quietly and with delicacy that in spite of appearances, the stigmatized individual is underneath it all a full human being. Now, that's hard to do, it's frustrating, it's annoying, it's frankly cucked, but it's probably the best course of action. We kind of have to be better. Unless they do actually start burning people at the stake and we enter full-blown McCarthyism moral panic, in which case, fuck politeness, we stigmatized are coming to bite back. And with that, friends, I think I've given a fairly long but detailed explanation of why these riots are happening, why these people go out in public and behave this way. They are engaged in this face threat that is making their social identity more salient than their personal identity. They are involved in a group that believes themselves as moral and as such are more prone to out-group hate. They are engaging in cult-like behavior that includes magical thinking and a shared origin story that makes them more cohesive. They are listening to leaders that tell them exactly, disassociate yourself, cut yourself off. And it's someone from your in-group, so of course you're more likely to identify with them because you have this in-group affinity. Is it all starting to make a little bit of sense? It doesn't end there though, friends. In the second part of this video, I will be covering the idea of moral panics. And just to give you a little preview, you're probably familiar with what a moral panic is. Of course, the most famous one would be the Salem witch trials, but we also saw it with mothers against drunk driving. And in more recent US history, we've probably seen it most prevalent, and somewhat ironically, with the Red Scare and McCarthyism. Leaving you with that, I hope I've given you something to think about. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned to the second part on moral panics. Oh, also one last thing, guys. Given YouTube's fucking imploding, I do have a Patreon, and you can give me shekels there if you don't know already. I do have a Discord set up there now. If you give $1, you have access to the Discord, or ask somebody for a link. It really doesn't matter. Alright, I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.